3. Wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the market she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the city gate she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. Because I have called out, and you refuse to listen, but have stretched out my hand, and no one has heeded. Because you have ignored all my counsel, and would not have any of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock you when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, and calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord, they would have none of my counsel, and despise all of my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way, and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroy them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease. Now I have a few questions that will help us understand this text. Number 1, why is wisdom referred as a woman? A huge theme in Proverbs is finding a good wife for a king and staying away from the wrong kind of women. Finding the right kind of woman is a metaphor for following wisdom instead of foolishness. Question number 2. Why is wisdom in the street crying out? Wisdom is crying out in the street because wisdom is easily available and wants to be found. There is a big red arrow flashing towards her, and she is yelling, "Listen to me." And yet people are not listening. They pretend to see her. They pretend to not see her or hear her because she is not fun or exciting. Number 3, why is wisdom laughing at you when bad stuff happens? Wisdom is laughing at you because you paid no attention to her when she was under that big red blinking arrow. And an example of this is when someone is speeding and wise people are following when wise people are following the speed limit. Later, when they see the speeder pulled over, they might think it is funny and laugh. You ignored that big red sign, so she will laugh when you die from your sin because you did not see her. Question number 4. Why will we not find wisdom when we try to find her? After you ignored her when she was under that big sign, you walked past her. She goes away, but when you are at your lowest low and you realize that you need her, she will hide from you because you did not listen to her words when she was making her knowledge very easy to access. What can we learn from wisdom? We can learn that finding wisdom is really easy to find. People do not listen to her because it is not the fun thing to do, but it will be better to listen to her in the long run. An example of this is when you have to take a test that you need to study for, but instead you play games. It may be fun now, but it will be even more fun to see that hard-earned A. Wisdom may not be fun now, but it will be better for you in the long run. I hope this has been edifying to you, and thank you for your kind attention.
Tonight I'll be reading John chapter 18, verses 12 through 14. Then the detachment of troops and the captain of the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Silas. Thanks, James. Y'all did a good job tonight. Wisdom can be laughing at you. Your personal example there, Silas, I'm sure that's happened to you. It's happened to me many times too. It's a good study. You know, I've been tasked with studying the trials of Jesus. And so we're getting right down to the last few hours of Jesus' life. And this evening, I also speak Sunday morning. So this evening I'm going to speak a little bit about the foundational issues associated with this trial and how it works and who the people are. And on Sunday, hopefully I can make some better applications of how to make this more relatable to us in our walk. But you know, one of the things I put on there, I put all the verses. There's many verses that relate to these trials. And if you'll notice there, I don't know if you can see it all, but I say there's 1 trial, 2 trials, 3, all the way to 6 trials. Now somebody may argue with me over that, and that's fine. I think I'm using the word trial rather loosely here. There's at least 6 different judicial proceedings, if you will. They may not all be trials, but they are all judicial proceedings that Jesus has to work through, right? And this is the backdrop here in Jerusalem at this time. There are, according to Josephus, who writes about 20 years after this event, and I think he embellished this somewhat, or at least some historians think that he has, that the population of Jerusalem could swell from a city of about 50,000 to a city over 2.5 million people. And of course, a lot of people will say, well, that's not really accurate, right? As a matter of fact, other historians will say that the city of Jerusalem is somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people, and because of Passover, there may be 5 to 9 times as many people in that town at this time, right? People that are coming from all over Palestine for the purpose of celebrating and partaking in the Passover. And so a lot of people are trying to find places to stay, trying to find places to have their feast. And the whole city is, I would say, somewhat in an uproar. If you have close to 200,000 people in a town that only occupies or normally only houses about 300,000. Or not 300,000, 30,000. I was thinking of a city that would be about this size, and I think of Shawnee, Oklahoma, is probably roughly 30,000 people. And if you moved almost 10 times as many people into that city, they would be bursting at the seams. And so I think that may make part of this story a little more understandable when people are seeking somebody that seems so easy to find. Right? When he first enters into Jerusalem, he's easy to find because of what he's doing. But afterwards, he's not so easy to find, and that's part of the reason that the Jews are attempting, or the chief priests are attempting to find anybody who'll tell us his whereabouts, right? So we can get this on the road and get this done. But we're going to go through some of the players in this trial here. He's going to have court-appointed appearances, but excuse me, before Annas the chief priest, Caiaphas the chief priest, the Sanhedrin, which is also called the council, Pontius Pilate, and Herod Antipas. And again, he'll have another proceeding before Pilate. It's interesting to note that one of the main players in all this, and I think this will become evidence as we go through this, is Annas, the chief priest. It seems odd that he would be the chief priest at the same time Caiaphas is the chief priest, right? I don't think that he is. I think it's more like saying that, Bill Clinton is President Bill Clinton. Even today, he's President Bill Clinton. President Bush was President Bush, and we still call them that even to this day, even though they're not effectively the president. I think the chief priest, and I put chief priest on there, I should have put high priest. The high priest at that time would have been Caiaphas during the time Jesus was in Jerusalem, but Annas is the former high priest, or at least a former high priest. And it's very likely that Annas, as well as other chief priests that would have spanned the time between Annas and Caiaphas, were on the Sanhedrin. They were part of that council. That was part of how the Sanhedrin council worked, is they would have people that were of lofty status that would be on that. I don't know if you can read all this. I can barely read that myself. We see on a map here, this is oops, that's not what you do. What's that one? As we enter Jerusalem here. We know that Jesus started here in Bethany. We know that he makes his way into what I think is the Gold Gate, or the East Gate, into the temple. That's how he enters the city at the beginning of Passover. We see, and I put this map on here mainly to see this. You can't read a lot of these places on here, but this over here says that hopefully, or possibly, that's the house of Caiaphas. Around over here, it's not going to be shown here, it's going to be the house of Annas. Some of these trials happen in different palaces. They happen in a palace here for Annas. They happen in a palace here for Caiaphas. They'll go over here to the palace of Herod, which is actually where Pilate is staying, because that's a palace of Herod the Great. And then we know that he eventually makes back over to the temple and has some type of judicial proceeding there with the Sanhedrin. And then eventually he makes his way, as he's crucified, he makes his way to Golgotha. But all of these places here that he's at, when he's taken, when he's arrested here in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's brought into town, this right here, I know it's not to scale, but all of this stuff, when he's being transferred from one place to the next, it's just, we're talking about small city blocks. We're not talking about they're walking him a half a mile or a mile to places. They're walking him very close to other houses, to a couple of houses, and at least two instances that are very close together. So he's not being paraded all over town during this period of time when he goes from one place to the next. In John the 11th chapter, I'll read that there. It says, "Then many of the Jews that had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him." Now we're talking about an event. I'm kind of switching gears here real quickly. We're talking about an event that happens right here in Bethany, a couple of weeks before the Passover, and it's the raising of Lazarus, right? So what happens before this verse? Excuse me, is Lazarus being raised from the dead? So we see what happens here, that many believed in him. Many Jews believed in him after Lazarus was brought back from the dead. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. This is going to present a monumental problem here for these chief priests. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation." The Jews and the rulers here are seeing that there's about to be a major problem, right? Jesus is getting too popular. He's getting too big of a following, and they know that's going to mean that the Jews or the Romans are going to crack down hard on them. And that kind of starts this whole process of wanting to go capture Jesus, as we read a little farther. It says, "And one of them, Caiaphas, who's the high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish.'" He's concerned that Jesus is going to cause the Romans to come down hard on the entire nation because he's going to be a king, or at least so they think. Now this he did not say on his own authority, but being a high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. He did prophesy that. That's what Jesus would do in the end. But the concern here is that he thought that one man should die for the people and not the whole nation. We skip down to verse 53. It says, "Then from that day on they plotted to put Jesus to death." Skip down a little farther and it says, "Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, and they might seize him." So this command is obviously going to make its way back to Judas. Judas is in a situation here to where he wants to gain from this, or he's the man who is a robber, obviously. And in Mark 4 and verse 1, it says, "After 2 days it was the Passover, the feast of the unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people.'" Okay, so they've got some concerns here. They want to take Jesus. The Bible says they want to kill Jesus. They want to have somebody tell them where he is, but they don't want this to happen during the feast, right? They don't want this to happen during the time in which it does happen, because they're concerned about an uproar of the people. If there's an uproar of the people, Rome is in town, and Rome will take care of that nation right then, so they don't want a riot to ensue. They don't want Jesus to be defended here, and they've got a whole lot of people in that town, close to 200,000 people, a whole lot more than they usually do. So they're afraid that if they take him, the people will be concerned. The same people that were there in the triumphant entry of Jesus. The same people that said, Hosanna. The same people that were honoring Jesus as he came into town. Those are the people that they were concerned with. Matthew 26:14, it says, Then one of the 12 called Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and said, What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought opportunity to betray him. So there was a time before, excuse me, before the Passover feast, there was a time that Judas went to them and said, I'll give him to you. I'll tell him where you're at. I'll tell you guys where he's at. And they negotiated for 30 pieces of silver. And then we find out in the Last Supper, John 13:30 says, having received the piece of bread, he, Judas, then went out immediately, and it was night. That was when Judas went out and told the chief priests where Jesus would be. Obviously, he went to the Mount of Olives, to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where he would park himself, and that's where he would talk and teach and pray. And that's where he told the high priest he would be. Now, so I say all this to say this. I think what we're going to see in the process of this trial, and I may be wrong, but Jesus was being delivered to them at a very short notice, right? The chief priest said, if somebody knows where he's at, tell me, tell us. Judas eventually goes and says, hey, I'll negotiate some money here for you and I'll tell you where he's at. Well, he comes to them that very night in which the trials will all commence the next morning very, very early, and says, hey, I know where he's at. And I would think the first thing they think is, well, are we going to have to do this in the cover of darkness? Will the crowds know about this? Will there be a problem? We didn't want to do this during the feast, but it looks like we're going to have to. I think to some degree they were caught off guard in this. They were caught off guard as to how they were going to handle this, and they handled it in the most horrible way to handle it. They handled it going against every bit of against their justice system that the Lord had helped create and establish. And they did it in the cover of darkness. So, as that is the backdrop, we'll see what happens. John, the 18th chapter, verse 12 says, Then the detachment of troops, I think James just read this, and the captain of the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So we know that, I think we're going to find out as we study this, that Annas, who's a man who's, by all estimations, was in his 80s at this point in time, he was a man who was, just during this era, since they were under occupied Rome, they were being occupied by Rome, Rome dictated who the high priest would even be. They didn't have an open selection to choose who their high priest was, and so at some point, Annas was the high priest, and he was the one that was strongly considered the important figure here amongst these folks. And I would suggest that there's a good chance that Annas was the one that set all this stuff in motion to happen this night. He was already ready. I think Jonathan said a couple of weeks ago at what time these trials began. You know, Jesus, at the point of this first trial, or this first judicial proceeding, if you will, Jesus has probably been awake for about 30 hours. He's been awake a very long time. He's going before somebody in the middle of the night who's going to ask him some questions. We won't get into that today. But it's very disturbing how this plays out, and it just shows how much power Annas had. He was the father-in-law of the current high priest, Caiaphas. Annas was the high priest for 5 or 6 years, from AD 6 to AD 15, approximately 20 years earlier. The next two high priests, including one of his sons, were both deposed after about a year when Caiaphas was appointed. So Caiaphas is going to be the high priest for about, I believe he's a high priest for about 10 years, but Annas wasn't high priest for about 9 years as it shows up there on the chart. He had no fewer than 5 of his own sons and 1 grandson to fill the position of high priest after him, not including his son-in-law Caiaphas. So you've got, at the very least, nepotism involved here in who the high priest. And you also have an issue with Rome dictating who's there. And if they dictate who's there, they've got to stay there for a reason. And I would submit to you tonight, there's probably a good reason Annas was in there as long as he was, and his family remained in there as long as they did, because he was possibly giving some money to these guys or doing exactly what they wanted to have happen. And that made me search a little deeper. If you look back far enough in history, if you look in the court of the Gentiles, which I think I have on here, when you enter the temple complex, and I'll call it that, it's a walled area here. And when you enter it, I think this is the Gold Gate. This is the East Gate. This is where Jesus would have entered when he came into town 5 days earlier. And this area right here is called the Court of the Gentiles. I believe this area over here too is called the Court of the Gentiles. But people could enter into this area here. You couldn't go into this area here unless you were a Jew. At least some of these areas you could go into. But this area right here was like what it turned out to be a big bazaar, from what I understand, a big marketplace. And these marketplaces, if you look at some of the depictions of these columns, they're monstrously tall. They go back very deep up in here. They're sheltered. And it looks like Annas would actually set up booths in there. And he would sell things to people who had traveled maybe hundreds of miles to be there for Passover. And I was going to read a little bit about how he conducted business here. If I could find what slide. Sometimes I can't. Well, I can't find the slide. But what would happen was he would set up these markets in here, and he would sell travelers. Number one, if you walked into this area here and you wanted to buy a sacrifice, you had to convert whatever coinage you had or money you had to tipple coins, right? So one of the things he would do, he was a merchant in here. He would set up merchants here who would make their money in the temple money, and they would charge a 25% fee, from what I understand. That's from John MacArthur would say that. Also, he would sell them sacrifices in here. For people who had to travel a great distance, they couldn't bring their own animal to sacrifice. And oftentimes, when you bring your own sacrifices, you would have priests in here that would actually judge your sacrifice. And they would judge it, well, that cow has a speck on it that it shouldn't have. It has a disability that's not really seen, and that would require those people to actually exchange money and actually buy one of the sacrifices that are offered there. And it looks like Annas ran the majority of these. The booths of the sons of Annas, it's a thing. They were on the Mount of Olives as well, the Court of the Gentiles. He would make great sums of money. Not only would he charge a 25% transfer fee from their money to temple money, but he would also mark up animals up to 10 times as much as they would sell in the streets. So they would come in here and be taken advantage of by Annas. These booths are the same booths that I would submit to you were the ones that Jesus looked at and tipped over when he called that area, the Court of the Gentiles, or in the temple complex, a den of thieves. Right? Mark 11 and 27 would say, when they came again to Jerusalem, as they were walking to the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him and said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the authority to do these things? Well, what authority he was referring to was, if I can get back to where I need to be. Well, the authority, I don't know why I don't have that passage up there, but the authority for him to come in and dictate what gets turned over and what doesn't get turned over. He said, what authority do you have to do this? Jesus, what authority do you have to come in and ruin the booths of the sons of Annas' way of making money? And Jesus, of course, in this instance right here, didn't tell them. Says, I'm not going to tell you what authority I do this by, because they wouldn't answer his questions. His authority obviously was coming from God, and he didn't want to see this place turn into a den of thieves, and that's what it was. And I would suggest to you this morning, submit to you, that it was primarily because of Annas. And Annas wanted Jesus arrested maybe for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was because he was destroying his business. And he was acting on the authority of God. Now, there was much more to this story, I know, but that's one of the reasons. And I suspect there's a good case to say that Annas was the one that sent this group of men out to arrest Jesus. And he was the first one Jesus was brought to. He's the first guy that got the question. I'm hoping that he would get some confession out of Jesus. It didn't work that well for Annas. Let's go to the second guy. There's not a whole lot you can find on Caiaphas. I looked to search all the history I could on him. There's not a lot to find out about him other than the fact that he's the son-in-law of Annas, and that may tell you enough. So Annas has a judicial proceeding. It looks like it's with very few people that are even there. Jesus responds to him. Jesus gets hit in the face as a result of his response to him. Annas says, I'm done with you. I'm going to send you to my son-in-law. Let's see what my son-in-law can do. Now, this all happening 3 or 4 in the morning. They have to do it in the cover of darkness. They don't want to alert the crowds. They can't do it in following their typical or their normal judicial practices because you're not supposed to hold court in the middle of the night. It's got to be daylight, right? So they're doing all things secretly here. It looks like Caiaphas was doing a good job, that he had a 19-year career there in Jerusalem. So the Romans were pleased with him and what he did. So we'll skip down past him. It looks like, well, I'll go back to him in just a second. One of the things that's kind of frustrating me in trying to sort out the timeline and where Jesus was and where he went next, it looks like in this second proceeding that was before the Jewish court here with Caiaphas, that there was the majority of the Sanhedrin were there. It appears as though that was the case. And then it looks like just for a short instance, as the sun's coming up, they make an attempt to make certain that they bring Jesus to get some type of legal way of getting this done, right? Let's go before the Sanhedrin. Let's make it look all righteous and legal. Let's do it in the right way. And so they bring Jesus to the Sanhedrin. This process looks like it may have only lasted 5-10 minutes. I mean, he was already railroaded to begin with. This process lasted a very short time. The Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was the Jewish courts. You know, we would sometimes you hear people say it's similar to what the Supreme Court would have been here, although it's probably a little different than our Supreme Court. They didn't really oversee all the lower courts that were in Israel, but they would in the event they couldn't find a lower court could come to a decision. This court would actually rule in that instance. But you go all the way back to the Old Testament, Deuteronomy the 16th chapter. It says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you according to the tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. You shall follow what is altogether just." You know, it's had its origins in these teachings right here. Although when I go to try to find out or trace this all the way back to the Old Testament time, it's very difficult to trace the Sanhedrin back to Old Testament times. But this process was obviously part of Old Testament times. Numbers 11 and verse 16 says, Then the Lord said to Moses, "Assemble for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the people's elders and officers, and you shall take them to the tent of meeting, and they shall stand there with you." They were there to judge, right? And there's going to be 70 of them, plus one. In that instance, it was Moses, making 71. It talks about this information is sourcing several books when it says every judge was required to have the following 7 attributes: wisdom, humility, awe of heaven, a loathing for money, even his own, a love of truth, and the love of the people at large, the love of the people at large, and a good reputation. So they were supposed to be well-respected people to be on the 70, to be part of the 70. They included high priest, which included the acting high priest and the former high priest and members of the chief priestly families, elders, which are tribal and family heads of the people in the priesthood, scribes, which are legal professionals and law experts. And to my understanding, they did not all have to be Levites, right? There may be some challenge to that, but I couldn't tell that they all had to be Levites. Obviously, the high priest needed to be. And one of the responsibilities that I would that would seem to go without saying is they were looking forward to the day, or they should have been looking forward to the day that the Messiah would come, right? So you would think it would be part of their job to include the identification and the confirmation of the Messiah. Well, they have the Messiah standing right in front of them, and they still can't confirm it's him. You go back to John, the first chapter. That's a text concerning John the Baptist. In John 1:19, the Bible says, "Now this is a testimony of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who are you?' He confessed." John the Baptist confessed and did not deny, but confessed, 'I am not the Christ.' And they asked him, 'What then? Are you Elijah?' He said, 'I am not.' 'Are you a prophet?' He answered, 'No.' Then they said to him, 'Who are you, that we may give an answer to those who sent us? What do you say about yourself?'" I would think that would be something they would be very interested in, and they were with John, thinking that maybe if we send a group of men, maybe the Sanhedrin sent those out, to say, let's look at John and see if he's the Messiah. Well, John said he's not. And so one of the responsibilities included trying to sort through and figure out who the Messiah is. But in the end, they had too good of a deal going. They didn't want to see the Messiah. They had a pretty good cottage industry going there in the temple, and they liked it. They liked what they had going on. In legal terms, the law demanded three things. Publicity of the trial, liberty of defense allowed to the accused, and a guarantee against dangers of testimony. Accordingly, one witness is no witness, for there must be at least two who know the fact. Deuteronomy 7:6 says, "No one is to die on the testimony of one witness. A fact must be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses." This rule was to apply here, and if you notice in the trials during, and we'll go over Sunday, with Caiaphas, they had two witnesses that were testifying about Jesus destroying the temple and building it back up in 3 days, or destroying it in 3 days. And then in this instance right here, they couldn't find two witnesses that would even agree. They couldn't find two witnesses that would agree. They didn't allow Jesus to have his own witnesses. Obviously, there was no publicity of the trial. So they were completely going against the rules associated with a fair trial, according to the Sanhedrin. In Matthew 23 and verse 1, it says, Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat." You'd think that'd be a seat of judgment. "Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say, and they do not." You couldn't trust them in anything. I've got water, Terry, thanks. You couldn't trust them in anything. But he did say, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But don't do according to their works. These guys, in the end, were vicious liars. They were vicious liars. And they wanted to bring to the climax a swift death to a very, very good, at the very least, he was a very, very good man. And at the most, he was God. But they wanted to put him to death. Some of the things they did go against here as far as their rules in these proceedings. Now, granted, some of these rules, when I read this, I have to say this, I have to footnote this a little bit and say, when you read what the rules were that pertain to the Sanhedrin, some of these rules were written several years after this occasion here, after this occasion that Jesus went before the Sanhedrin. But a capital offense or a death penalty case, the verdict of guilty had to be reserved for the following day. They had to sit with what they wanted to, they had to think about it for a day. It would make sense. If you're going to kill somebody, these judges, these people on the Sanhedrin had to wait another day. No criminal trial could be carried out through the night, nor even in the afternoon. The judges who condemned a criminal had to fast all day. The condemned was not executed the same day as the sentence. All these things were violated in this instance, and a multitude more. There's a whole lot more but one of the things also, they had junior members and they had senior members, right? They had people who'd been there for a short time and people who'd been there for a long time. This happens in some of the elders' meetings that I go to sometimes, sometimes they'll ask me what I think first, and I say, well, I'd rather hear what you guys say. Well, that's not how it's supposed to work, because they don't want me to be impacted by what they would say. They want me to have my own opinion. The same was true for these jurors, so to speak, that were judging Jesus. They wanted the junior members to speak first. Well, I think he's guilty, or I don't think he's guilty. Well, in the instance when they went before Caiaphas, Caiaphas ripped his shirt and said, what else do we need to hear? He's worthy of death. You wouldn't think that would impact everybody there when the high priest does that? They violated so many rules that applies or should have applied to them. Now we're going to Terry, I told you I had a water. Did it? I'm rude like that sometimes. I'm sorry. So we know that Jesus goes before 3 Jewish high priests, to include the Sanhedrin in the second and third proceedings. They do not have the ability to kill Jesus, so they want to send him to somebody who can kill him, which is this guy called Pontius Pilate. He's the Roman procurator over Judea. I'm not real smart. Sometimes I have to read what that actually means or get a definition, but procurator is an officer of the Roman Empire entrusted with management of the financial affairs of a province and often having administrative powers as an agent of the emperor. So he was Tiberius in Jerusalem. He was Caesar there, as it relates there. He could do just about anything he wanted to. Plus, he could kill him, right? He could put Jesus to death. He lived in Caesarea, but in these special feast days, they would come. He would stay at the palace of Herod the Great, which was the father of Herod Antipas, and he would stay with a large band of soldiers because he knew there was a chance these guys would get out of hand, that there would be a riot. And when there's a riot, Rome doesn't look very fondly on that, and they kill people. They kill a whole lot of people. This guy's known to kill a lot of people when things would get out of hand. He was married to Claudia, who is the granddaughter of Augustus Caesar. Emperor Tiberius, who would have been the emperor of the time at Rome during this process, was the wedding gift was for him to be the ruler of Judea, which from what I understand was not a very nice outpost. It was about as far as Rome as you could get within the Roman Empire, and it was not looked upon as being a very good outpost. So he wasn't very happy to be there, he doesn't appear. He was hated by the Jews, and he didn't learn from his predecessors. He knew that the Jews were very conscientious about who they served, and they served God. And when they would bring an emperor in there and parade him around, or at least a statue of him, and pretending him to be God, they didn't like that at all. And you know what? When the Jews would riot in those instances, he would kill people. That's how he would deal with that. He would kill people. So he was somebody who was extremely hated by the Jews. Extremely hated by the Jews. Which makes it even harder to take when you read John 19 and 15, when they cry out, "Away with him," talking about Jesus, "away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And they say, "We have no king but Caesar." So they hated Pilate, but they hated Jesus more. They hated one of their own more than they hated Pilate. The next guy that he goes to, Pilate obviously finds out that Jesus is a Galilean. We're up here in Jerusalem, which is Judea. Up here is the Galilean region right here. We know that all the bigwigs, which includes Herod Antipas, he goes to Jerusalem for a feast. When there's feast days, he shows up here. So he's the ruler of Galilee. Pilate is the ruler of Judea. And so when Pilate finds out that Jesus did all of his miracles, most of his teaching here, he said, "Hey, I've got an out here. Let's send him to Herod." Herod's in town. Herod Antipas is the son of Herod the Great. Herod the Great's the same guy that was the Herod during the time that Jesus was born, when he killed all the babies up to 2 years of age in Bethlehem. He was a horrible, despicable man. When Herod the Great died, Rome made Pilate the ruler of Judea. Up until that point, Herod the Great was ruler over all of this area. But when he died, I think there's another Herod named Herod Archelaus, I think that's his name. Yeah, Archelaus. They made Pilate, and I don't think Archelaus died. I think he was actually deposed. But they had him rule this for a time. But when he failed, Rome put Pilate in charge of Judea. And you'll read that there must be some type of rift between Herod Antipas and Pilate that was resolved during this time of Jesus' death here, or these trials. And it was likely because they were a little territorial here. That I would think Herod wasn't too happy to be stuck here when he should be ruling all this like his daddy was. But Pilate had an opportunity to send him to Herod, and Herod Antipas heard him for a while, kind of mocked him and sent him on his way. Herod was He was kind of a goof. You read about some of these guys and what they did and how they acted. They had so much power behind what they could say. They could say the words and people could lose their lives, right? So you could be a despicable ruler if you had that sort of power. And both of these guys were. They were despicable people. Herod Antipas was the guy who put John the Baptist to death, right? Kind of on a whim. Made a bad statement. All of a sudden, he had to give John the Baptist his head on a platter. So they were just despicable people. And it appears as though Herod just wanted to see Jesus do some type of fancy trick, and that's the whole purpose of that trial. There wasn't a reason for him to judge Jesus at all, or he didn't appear to be given any reason to judge Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus do some magic, if you will, and then they mocked and made fun of him, sent him back to Pilate. Luke 8:2 would tell us, and certain women who had been healed of evil, spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna and many others who provided for him from their sustenance. So we find out that even in this despicable arena that this guy was in, that they had somebody that worked there named Chuza, who was married to a woman named Joanna. And Joanna was somebody that served and financed Jesus' work. In that despicable situation, there were still people who were willing to come after and out themselves, if you will, and serve Jesus and follow him and finance his travels. Acts 13:1 says there's somebody else in that situation. So the church that was in Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, and Mania, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. Herod the Tetrarch is Herod Antipas. So you find in these situations there were people who were desperate to seek some sort of the truth, and that believed the truth and actually became followers of Jesus, which is actually a remarkable thing. So, I'm setting the stage for what's going to happen Sunday, and I kind of wanted to give a little bit of a history of, like I said, of these trials. On Sunday morning, we'll go over what was said, how they were said, and there's a lot of really deep, meaningful things that were said by Jesus during this process. And when you look at what Jesus said and what he was having to endure at this time, you can't help but be amazed that he could do this under this type of pressure. He was all alone. Nobody was with him. Nobody was standing up for him. Everybody had fled. And yet he was standing there amongst a bunch of men who hated him. And oftentimes he remained silent in the face of some things that were very egregious, despicable type of comments that were made about him. And he stood quiet. And he went through, and I'll say 6 of these. He kept going from one to the next, then back and forth. And I suspect he was beginning to wonder, when's this going to end? He knew how the story ended. But they had to get him on the cross early. And they had to try him in the middle of the night. And they got their verdict at some point, or they at least got the approval of Pilate to put him to death. And it looks like by 9 a.m. in the morning that day, he was on the cross. And on Sunday morning, we're going to talk about more of the process that got him there. I'm hopeful this was interesting. You know, the history of this, you can go to so many different sources that tell you so many different things. I'm hopeful that I got the history on most of these guys correct. And I'm hopeful I got what was incentivizing some of these guys, particularly Annas. They had a lot of reasons to destroy Jesus, not good reasons, but a lot of this was due to their greed and their ability to continue as they had and continue to make money and maybe continue the nepotism that has been part of the chief priest there during that period of time, to continue to have more sons-in-law or more sons as chief priest or high priest. As always, we don't want to close the gospel message without giving an opportunity for those who believe in Jesus, believe he died for our sins, and would like to be buried with him in baptism to rise up to walk in newness of life. We give that opportunity. We also give an opportunity for those who desire the prayers of this congregation. We stand able and willing to do that if you'll make those wishes known as we stand and sing a song of invitation.